Okay. So every week in the class, I'll be doing a little bit of video work. Sometimes you'll see me, sometimes you'll see slides. But today, since I want to show you a couple maps and a couple other visuals about Mexico, I figured that slides would probably work best. So, today, just a brief overview of Mexico, but we'll be revisiting the environments of Mexico many times over the course of the semester. You even have some readings that'll deal directly with them, especially some specific ones. But, Mexico's got a really widely varying set of environments and both physical and cultural environments. So physical ones, they deal with the natural environment, and cultural ones deal with the people and culture, obviously. And one of these kind of themes that you'll see that kind of link both the cultural and physical environments in Mexico and throughout Middle America, so that would be southern Mexico, Guatemala, a little bit of Belize, is kind of centers around volcanoes. And there are a large number of them, and they're all somewhat active given the tectonic activity in the region, so the plates crashing together, subducting and causing volcanism. Anyway, before I kind of dig into this, I wanted to point out some of the text for this week's lesson mentions the West Indies, and it's easy to get confused with the East Indies. So around the time of Columbus setting sail to famously, quote-unquote, discover the New World, a lot of trade, a lot of exotic trade in Europe was with the Indies, or what came to be known as the East Indies. These Indies was India and kind of the nations highlighted here on this map. So India, which of course at that time contained Pakistan as well, and Bangladesh, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, all these places. These were the East Indies because they were east of Europe. The West Indies, which is where Columbus landed, Hispaniola and the islands of the Caribbean, they were known as the West Indies because they were west of Europe. Sometimes here in North America, we kind of look at the Caribbean, we say, how can that be west? Because it's east of where a lot of us live. But indeed, the Caribbean was known as the West Indies. Back to Mexico. All right, a lot of us know approximately where Mexico sits, but we kind of don't realize that it's pretty large and consists of a lot of different, pretty disconnected, really, or very different anyway, regions. So, some characteristics to highlight in Mexico is it shares a really long border with the U.S., famous border, right? It's one that's maybe a little bit more porous than many North Americans might like, and is also a site of some pretty intense international trade. One of the very first international trade agreements that focused on trade free of major barriers, of course, was negotiated between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico in the early 90s, NAFTA, and because of that, we have a lot of international trade with Mexico. Mexico's got a lot of very large cities, but one of the largest in the world, in fact, is Mexico City. If you take all of the kind of urban area of Mexico City and add up all the people, it's about 20 million. So it's actually one of the largest, I think it's the second largest national capital city in the world after Tokyo. To put that in context with the U.S., Washington, D.C., Metro D.C. has about 8 million people. So Mexico City is easily twice as large as D.C. It's even twice as large as New York City. L.A. has about 4 million people, a little less than 4 million people. So you can imagine, Mexico City is big. The peripheral regions, though, including Baja California here and the Yucatan, are very disconnected from the central region of Mexico. And they're disconnected in a number of different ways. One, of course, is the physical connections. If you notice, Mexico really connects with the Rocky Mountains. So here we have North America. We have the Rocky Mountains of Canada and the United States in through the Sierra Madre, which is really a southern extension of the Rocky Mountain Plateau, right? So in some ways, Mexico is connected physically, geophysically, so that would be like physical earth forms. It's connected with the mountainous regions of the United States. And then if you look at Baja California and the Yucatan, these are very different. And then to some extent, the Tampico kind of region here, the Caribbean or Gulf Coast of Mexico, they're very different. They're connected to different landforms. And so they actually exhibit pretty different cultural and physical characteristics, as you might imagine. Politically, Mexico is pretty well divided. There's 31 states and one federal district. Of course, the federal district, kind of almost unplanned, is pretty central, all things considered, to the country. That's here in, here in the middle of the country, sort of the middle of the country, down in this region here. 21, Distrito Federal. Sorry, I don't speak Spanish, I speak Portuguese. So anytime I say any Spanish word, it's with a Portuguese accent, or Brazilian accent, really. It's very different. So anyway, Mexico is pretty well developed, and part of this comes from the kind of the history of Mexico. Of course, Spanish conquistadors landed in what's today Mexico, and basically made a beeline after some skirmishes on the Gulf of Mexico coast. They basically made a beeline for an area very close to what is today Mexico City, and there they kind of set up camp after vanquishing the folks living there, and then set up a very centrally organized and managed colonial economy, right? But this has kind of persisted in Mexico's political geography. Just to put Mexico in context, population as of 2010, about 112 million. It's about a third as large as the U.S.'s population. But at any given time, about 15% of this 112 million people or so live in the U.S. Of course, the U.S. is actually less popular of a emigration destination as it was in the past. During the 90s in particular, it was, and slightly before that, it was a very popular destination for folks who are moving out of Mexico. Today, it's still the most popular, but there are other countries in Europe and elsewhere where that are popular with Mexicans who are leaving Mexico as well. One of the things that kind of an externality or an outcome of the housing crisis and economic collapse or crash of 2008-2009 was that emigration from Mexico declined very rapidly. Capital of Mexico, as I mentioned before, is Mexico City, one of the 5 most populated cities in the world, and the only national capital as bigger as Tokyo. Well, if you fit 20 million people into Mexico City, right here, right, notice if we look at the population in 1970, it's pretty similar now. Population density, that's people per unit area. The densest populations here in the central part of Mexico. So as you can imagine, I mentioned that the Baja California and the Yucatan were pretty remote, disconnected regions. They're also very sparsely populated in the grand scheme of things. Mexico gained independence from Spain in 1810, and it has a rich culture and history. So there's a lot of ancient civilizations, the Maya and others. There's a layering of indigenous and colonial cultures, and kind of a flip-flopping of cultural values. So initially, the Spanish looked negatively on most indigenous kind of heritage. Then and today that's kind of changed. Indigenous heritage in Mexico has become something that's somewhat celebrated. Same thing with wealth. Mexico has a pretty interesting sort of set of cultural values which can be sometimes confusing. This flip-flopping of cultural values can also lead to some weird situations, like in this picture of Teotihuacan, which is a ancient civilization site pretty close to Mexico City. If you look in the background of this picture here, you can actually see kind of a light blue colored shape in the background just in front of these mountains. This is a Walmart. So globalization clashes with the celebration of indigenous heritage, which is very popular in Mexico, to lead to some pretty interesting kind of cultural juxtapositions. Economically, Mexico's improved quite a bit over the last couple of decades. It still suffers from income equality that isn't the worst in Latin America, but it's pretty bad. So one way to measure income equality is the Gini index. The higher the value, the more unequal the distribution of economic wealth in a society is. So Mexico, the Gini index in 2010 was 47.2. Brazil, typically in the kind of worst category globally, in 2009 had a Gini index of 54.7. And you compare that to the US, which is 45 in 2004. And Sweden had a Gini index of 25 in 2000. Now, Sweden, therefore, is much more equitable in terms of its distribution of wealth than Mexico, Brazil, or the United States. So it's possible to have income inequality that's poor, right, or that's very unequal, but even folks who are kind of not living with a huge amount of money are still able to support themselves. Well, unfortunately, in Mexico, about 40 to 43% of Mexicans live below the poverty line, and the richest 10% control a lot of the wealth, around 36%. And as I mentioned before, since most people live in the central region, that's where the capital is, it's probably not a radical extension of your imagination to imagine that the central region is more wealthy. There are a lot of regions to Mexico, subregions. We have the arid northwest. We have the borderland region, the independent north, the central breadbasket, which contains Mexico City, the southern mountains, the humid Gulf lowlands, the oil basin in Gulf lowlands, and then the remote periphery, which includes Yucatan and Chiapas. Well, the Borderlands area, for a lot of people, this is stereotypical Mexico. The border is a focus because it shapes the subregion geomorphically, meaning the shape of it is actually all along the border. But it also focuses our political attention on the disagreements between the U.S. and Mexico in terms of immigration, also in terms of economic and environmental policy. This region, at one point in time, was kind of a more or less barren wasteland, but it has been increasingly industrialized with the onset of NAFTA and kind of over-the-border production. So we have, basically what were, and probably in some cases continue to be, sweatshop labor right across the border for the production of cheap consumer goods and let's say clothing consumed in the U.S. and Canada. The arid northwest, to give you a brief overview, and the independent north are fairly similar. They're desert climates that are very dry, of course, making agriculture difficult. They're sparsely populated, and those folks that live there are kind of more of a European background. They have more of a European background. They tend to focus on cattle ranching and extensive land uses, some mining, a little bit of agriculture. And then Baja California is connected physically to California, so there's a lot of tourism and then a pretty large fishing economy there. The Gulf lowlands, and the humid Gulf lowlands and the oil basin are areas that are dominated by oil exploitation. So, admittedly, this graphic is a couple years old now, but it shows the kind of development of oil around the colonial port of Campeche. Keep in mind, a lot of Mexico's economy relies on oil. There's about almost 2.5 billion barrels of oil per day as of last year, 2012. And it's about 25 to 30% of Mexico's exports, which is pretty impressive given that Mexico exports a lot of production under NAFTA, right? So this area along the Gulf is dominated by oil production, but there's also stuff. Sugar and sugarcane production and cattle ranching are pretty useful or reliable here. But the area does have the natural hazard of hurricanes, which can be pretty severe here. The central breadbasket includes the capital city of Mexico City. It was the primary area of food production, but it has become increasingly urbanized. So just like the Midwestern U.S., other parts of the U.S. where prime agricultural land has been turned into suburban and urban development, that's sort of the deal here, right? It's still highly productive, the areas that are agricultural, and the region does have some big cultural significance. So lots of archaeologically important sites, and former Aztec and Mayan cities can be found in this region, although more Aztec than Mayan. The southern mountain region is pretty rugged. It's sort of a self-sufficient region. This is where, this is where a lot of sort of the kind of almost libertarian Mexicans would kind of focus themselves regionally. There's some coastal tourism around Acapulco and Ixtapa. There's a big international harbor at Acapulco, but there's some national conflicts here. In 2006, there's a huge teacher strike. There's ongoing drug-related violence that has tamped down some tourism interest in the region. There's also the remote periphery, which includes the Yucatan and Chiapas. Now, Chiapas was pretty famous during the 1990s. It's the most remote part of Mexico, and there was a big uprising here of the Zapatistas, who were kind of arguing for more support for small farmers and agricultural lifestyles, also arguing for almost independence from the kind of Mexican oligarchy, and resisting the privatization of ejido agriculture, which is like subsistence communal agriculture. There's a large population of folks here in this region who have Mayan ancestry, and it also hosts a lot of Guatemalan refugees. There's also the Yucatan and Quintana Roo. They're sort of the same area. It's the kind of bump out that Mexico has on the southeastern part of it. Lots of tropical forest here. There's Mérida, which is a coastal town, or a colonial town rather, that's very popular with tourists. Of course, Cancun attracts a different type of tourist, right? So you have the kind of spring breaker resort town group that goes to Cancun, and then you have Mérida, which attracts cultural tourism. It's very Mayan, but it's also an area that has traditionally been underdeveloped, and so the maquiladora industry, the kind of export-oriented skilled labor industries, are really citing themselves here because of cheap labor. A couple words about Cancun. Yeah, might know it as a spring break destination, but actually in 1970 there was nothing there. It was literally a beach, and that was about it. It was actually developed through money from the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank. Planned in 1970, construction began in 1972, and over 37 years it went from basically a bunch of 127 people living near the beach to a city of almost 1 million, almost 750,000. Initially there were 7 government-funded hotels, and now there are more than 140. The thing is, this amazing transformation over less than 40 years, from nothing to a huge resort industry town, has often left folks who work in the tourist sector living in kind of substandard homes, making not that great of wages, right? So, yes, Cancun's a great spring break destination, but sometimes the externalities of this type of tourism weigh heavily on local populations. All right, in terms of an overview of Mexico, I'll leave it at that, but we'll be focusing on some Mexican environments. Don't forget the to-do list in the Week 2 folder, and good luck this week.